Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this live stream. In this chat, I'd like to talk about the lies that we're told. We live in a world now of permanent lies. Every news station, every newspaper, pretty much everything you see in supermarkets, any government building, is propaganda and lies designed to deceive and control you by use of invented moral panic. So all the moral panics that we see around us, and there are many that are being used against us, are just to fuck with our heads, nothing more. They're not real, and they never were. But in every single instance, they're used to take away our legal rights and increase our cost of living. So that's why they're there. Let's just go through some of these, and I've mentioned this in other videos, but I'll just go through them again and just add some narrative here as to how the sort of laws that have been brought in, and these laws are always brought in to protect us and to save us and to look after us and so on. So, but just understand this, and this is to take away every epidemic we've seen since the globalists have started to put their tentacles into the Western world. Every single one has been invented. So let's just look at some of that now. The first one is the male violence against women, the family violence as it's called. So we had this alleged epidemic that every husband was, beating wives, beating children, that sort of thing. Now they exaggerated the reality of this by 40 plus times, and they particularly concentrated on very poor, very violent black neighbourhoods in very poor, very violent sections of black neighbourhoods, and they used those anecdotal stats and then extrapolated them to say that it was a nationwide issue. But just on this male violence against women, they instituted something called the apprehended violence order, and it's got slightly different names in different countries, but effectively means that any woman can go into any police station or any courtroom and see like a public officer there and get what's called an apprehended violence order. So they can just go in and say, Billy Bob's either has abused me, is threatening to abuse me, or might abuse me. I think he could abuse me. Those sorts of things, and there's no rules of evidence, or there's no burden of proof. Just the sheer allegation alone is enough to produce this apprehended violence order. And what this means is the target of the order is not allowed to come within, say, for example, 200 meters of the person who's taken that order out. Now, the person that the order is taken out against may not even know, and probably doesn't know, that there's any order against them. Again, there's no requirement for a court hearing. There's no evidence needed. Someone can just go in and make the allegation. They can make it up. It can be a totally fictitious story. But now the liberty of the other person who's been named, their liberty is now removed. They're now under a sort of a form of administrative law, not a jurisprudence, as in the matter isn't going to be heard in a court, but they're under a form of administrative law. So if they, for example, they're in a supermarket or a grocery store and they happen to be in at the same time as a person who's taken the order out, then they're in breach of that, or it's now escalated to a sort of a quasi-criminal level. So now if they then go, for example, interstate, or if they also own a firearm that they may have owned for years, it could have been their grandparents' firearm that they've inherited, it doesn't matter. Now they've got that apprehended violence order against them. By even owning a firearm, they now have qualified as a criminal. They're now in breach of the law, so they can be arbitrarily arrested. And bear in mind, there's been no court hearing, no evidence has been produced, there's no legal process at all. It's purely administrative and purely allegation based. Now, this is a monstrous departure from due legal process and rules of evidence. If the person now, they're in prison, they've already been arrested, they're criminals. If they now want to take it to court, they have to take it to court themselves and dispute the original findings. Because if it goes to court, now when they've technically breached the order because they owned a firearm across state lines, that sort of thing, then they're being brought. They can only fight that part of the case against them. So they have to argue that they didn't cross state lines or that they didn't inherit their grandfather's firearm, which of course they did. So they can still be technically guilty, even though the original basis, the due cause, if you like, the original basis is completely false and fictitious and was never tested in a court of law. So this is a huge departure. You know, the politicians and the globalists and the media, they sold it, but we've got to do this to protect women. Look at the stats. Look at the stats. Look at all these women that are being killed and beaten. Look at it all. It's an epidemic of violence against women. We have to do these things to protect women and children. These women, they have little tiny children, baby, tiny. And the rhetoric just went off the planet. And I remember reading these articles, but the statistics were completely false, completely invented. There was no epidemic. Sure, in populations of hundreds of millions, you can find examples, and you know that's regrettable. But amongst hundreds of millions of people, I mean, you can find these sorts of things. Both ways, you know, women that kill their husbands with golf clubs and all sorts of things. It goes both ways here. We never hear about that other side, however. But so this is a huge departure from the rule of law and due legal process. So that was one of the big things. It was an epidemic that never existed. It required drastic legal measures to rectify a problem that never was there in the first place. But the politicians and the media, they cheered this on, and we just have to do it. We've got no choice. And next, you know, it became pretty much standard practice across the Western world. A similar thing occurred with rape epidemics. Now, the burden of proof for a capital offence like this, if someone's convicted of rape, they go to prison, and that's not unreasonable at all. But the burden of proof rests with the accuser. Now, if there's you know, witnesses or circumstances or injuries or you know, that sort of thing, then typically it's not a difficult situation to get a conviction. But in the event of no injuries, nobody forced anybody, nobody threatened anybody, he said, she said, then it's very difficult to get a conviction for rape for obvious reasons. Again, we come back to the idea, is an allegation alone without any evidence enough to send someone to prison? And it should never be so. So the rape, the legality around rape was changed. So gradually the burden of proof was moved little by little, because it's a rape epidemic. Every woman everywhere is getting raped. You know, college campuses, every female student is getting raped, you know, at least once a day, if not more often. So because it's such an epidemic, because it's so terrible and so widespread, we've got to do something. It's an epidemic. It's a moral panic. We have to do something. And again, the politicians and the bureaucrats and the globalist controlled media were right along with this. But what it did was it changed the burden of proof so that the person accused of raping someone had to prove that they didn't do it. Now that's a huge departure from standard practice of the rule of law. And typically only tyrannical governments use this form of justice. For example, in the communist Soviet Union or communist China, if you were accused of doing something, even though the evidence wasn't there to prove it in the first place, or to have a high balance of probability in the first place, you're a counter-revolutionary, you're an enemy of the people. Then that person who was accused had to prove they didn't do it. So the state only needed to say, well, you were in location X on Sunday. We say that was the place where the counter-revolutionary activity happened. We don't have to prove it. Now you have to prove that you were not there on Sunday. That's the level of proof you have to meet. But of course, the person was there on Sunday, but the state doesn't have to prove its case. And this is what the rape thing was like. I only had to prove, well, you know, Billy Bob went out with, you know, Billie Jean on Saturday night. That's all we have to establish. Now you prove you didn't do it, which is an absurd departure from due legal process. But again, these things came in And they, again, were cheered on by politicians. And some of these politicians were globalist flunkies. Others saw an opportunity to make political capital with women. You know, I'm the big hairy-chested he-man, and I'm here to protect you poor little girlies, and that sort of thing, which apparently is popular with women. They like hairy-chested he-man politicians. You know, the idea of I've got power because I can make other men beat that man up. That's often been a sort of a female fantasy. So for females who don't want to take responsibility for their own actions. The next one was male pedophiles. We had an alleged pedophile epidemic all across the Western world. And again, just to highlight how globalist these are, all these epidemics occurred at exactly the same time across all Western countries at the same time. Just suddenly these epidemics magically appear across Western countries, which allows them to change their jurisprudence, their rule of law, their due legal process, and the long hallowed. Just suddenly these epidemics magically appear across Western countries, which allows them to change their jurisprudence, their rule of law, their due legal process, and the long hallowed institutions of innocent until proven guilty. So again, it was very centrally scripted, centrally organised, centrally directed, and through the globalist control of the media. So there's supposed to be pedophiles. I remember watching electioneering two contenders for state governor, and it came down to a point where they were on this thing, there are pedophiles everywhere, which was a play for the women's vote. All these wicked, evil male pedophiles are out to get your children, mum. So what's mom going to do about it? Well, I'm going to vote for the politician who's going to get tough with those damn pedophiles because they're everywhere. So it gained them political traction, otherwise they wouldn't have done it. But so these two candidates are there. So candidate one says, well, I'm going to make sure that any pedophile is released from prison, having done their time, served their sentence, 6 kilometres. Oh yeah, 7 kilometres used to terrify the population and to herd them all towards choosing a particular medical direction and solution to things. We've got the climate epidemic and just the general moral panic. So, but in all cases, you know, the health epidemic takes away people's legal rights and choices. The climate epidemic takes away choices, but also adds many taxes and increases the cost of living. So globalists in the Western world have managed to erode many legal rights of citizens and corrupt the process of law. So we need to be very cognizant of that. Even before the globalists had taken total cognizant of that, even before the globalists had taken total control of the Western governments, some of these things were already in play. And our politicians then didn't speak out against it. I don't remember seeing them get up and make a thundering speech about how we can't arbitrarily accuse people on the basis of an allegation and then deny them their basic liberties and their rights of association and so on. I don't remember any politicians coming out with that. Well, I do remember the propaganda. It was nowhere near intense, say, 30 years ago as it is today, but I remember alleged, here's a good one, the epidemic of violence against homosexuals. That was another one. Papers in Australia where newspapers in Australia where it was said that a bunch of bashing and killing gay people was a sport that went on in Sydney, and gay people being murdered, you know, almost every second of every day in Sydney. This was, and then there was a graphic description of a bunch of alleged straight white males that had killed a gay guy. And it was hysterical. And then they jumped high and with both knees landed on his solar plexus, crushing his ribs and his lungs. Blood bubbled from his mouth while they did this and did that. Then they did, and then they did, then they did. So, and no one would have stayed alive to get that sort of punishment. But anyway, it came out later that whole thing was written by a gay guy. That whole thing was a complete invention, an utter and total fabrication. There had been no murder of a gay guy. There had been no gang going along and beating people up or beating them to death. It was completely made up, but it was part of bringing out various laws, hate laws, part of bringing out various laws, hate laws against straight people who were allegedly doing these terrible things to gay people. But the whole thing was invention. It never happened. That event never happened. It was all made up. And that's another example of it, the racism issues. That there's all these racism, moral panic invention. It simply isn't there. Well, the more recent one used in America is, white supremacists, which is code speak for people who voted for Donald Trump or people who don't agree with the globalist project. These sorts of things. So so have that takeaway there that every crisis, every single one over the last 40 odd years, every one of them has been invented and has been fabricated and pushed by the media and by the body politic to take away our legal rights and increase taxes on us. So they control us, in other words, by instituting just a wall of lies, shutting down the political market and the political ideas. So they control any political candidate who's standing for office or any sort of senior office where they can control policy and really make laws. Every one of them is either chosen and approved by the globalists, or they'll be destroyed by the globalists. And if a candidate does make it through to the vote, the point where the public is voting and they don't have control of that candidate, then the entire media establishment will be turned against them. And there'll be an endless array of little waif-like crying girls with torn blouses, and he tried to rape me. And you get all that sort of stuff, and they'll be thrown at them constantly, and they'll be knocked out of the race. So shutting down the political market is that all the main parties have the same policies, which are globalist-approved policies, and all the candidates are globalist-approved candidates. So whoever wins, or whoever, but it's taken away. It's shut down democracy. Democracy doesn't exist in any sense. You vote only for the candidates they let you vote for, who all follow the same policies that the globalists have decided they will follow. So they've shut down the political market there completely. Not that it's ever been 100% perfect all the time. It hasn't been, but now it's completely shut down. Like rigging the election. The other thing is the arbitrary application of the rule of law. The rule of law doesn't exist anymore. It's arbitrarily applied. Black Lives Matter can torch neighbourhoods and commit murder and bash people and do all sorts of things, but you try and oppose the lockdown without any damage or anything at all, or without graffitiing anything, and the police will come along and club you and shoot rubber bullets at you. So it's clearly the globalists support this side of it, but not that side. And if you're against the globalists, then the full force of the institutions of the state will be used against you. Which means, by the way, that the police, along with all other institutions, the police are an independent body. They're not a globalist enforcement bunch of goons. They're an independent body, but you wouldn't think so. They're meant to force. So the arbitrary application of the rule of law, also the arbitrary application, you weren't in a certain place at a certain time, then the politicized judge will just simply not allow that evidence to be heard. No, I won't allow evidence from those witnesses. No, I won't allow those. So they'll use strange technical arguments to make sure that evidence that would exonerate the accused, assuming the accused is a Trump supporter or straight white guy, they just won't allow that evidence. So because the guy's got no evidence, then if the judge won't allow it, then they can declare it. That's something that I'm seeing or hearing about more and more around the place, and that's a very disturbing trend. Also been politicised, by the way. I don't see a single politician, not one, getting up and talking about that, or any of these legal activists that swarm in support of help illegal criminal immigrants, illegal aliens that have committed crimes. They've got armies of lawyers ready to support them. But you get an innocent straight white guy who's being clearly railroaded through a corrupt legal system, and there's no one in sight to help him. Just as an example, one I came across not that long ago, where a woman she was getting fairly intense psychological counselling for for being a nutcase and having very violent fantasies, that sort of thing. And the guy, psychiatrist, and for a court hearing, and so it was there, and the judge was reading through it, realised that it would have absolutely shot the woman's case to pieces. The guy would have won, and won easily and handsomely. But the judge looked at it and said, "Oh, I can't read that writing. Evidence disallowed. I find in favour of the..." And the guy would have won, and won easily and handsomely. But the judge looked at it and said, "Oh, I can't read that writing. Evidence disallowed. I find in favour of the..." So this is the level of corruption that's going on at all levels. So we need to be comprehending of this, and we need to get to a situation where these people can be held accountable, because at the moment they control too many of the levers, and we really need to get hold of those levers again. Not to exact retribution, I'm personally against that, but to ensure the independent application of the law and so on. Because just by doing that, just by that alone, the rule of law applied equally to all, due legal process, the rules of evidence, just by doing that, the globalists will be defeated by that alone, or it'll frustrate their project to such an extent that it won't be worth them pursuing it. So we really do need to get control of these things. I mean, other things we can do, have more media outlets that report the truth rather than the wall of lies we're deluged with all the time. But if we get control of that, not control of, just insist on the complete end of the application of law in all its levels and forms, then just by that alone, the globalists will be severely frustrated in their project. You've been with Tassus today.